Today we examine a positional masterpiece by Siegbert Tarrasch, where he demonstrates the power of strategic strangulation. With his deep prophylactic moves, Tarrasch gradually cramps his opponent's position, preventing any counterplay and leaving him with no room to breathe. No sacrifices, no spectacular combinations, just pure positional dominance. So let's see how step by step Tarrasch squeezes the life out of his opponent's game. Tarrasch starts with e4, his opponent Jackson Showalter plays e5, and after knight f3, knight c6, Tarrasch goes for the Italian game. And instead of common bishop c5 or knight f6, black goes for the Hungarian defense, bishop e7, after which black gets a solid but a little bit cramped position. Black usually plays the Hungarian defense when he wants to avoid well-known lines. Tarrasch immediately attacks the center with d4. Now black has an option either to surrender the center by capturing on d4 or to reinforce his central pawn by playing d6. That's exactly what black does in our game. And now white has an option. He can either transition into a slightly better endgame by capturing on e5 and exchanging the queens, or, as Tarrasch did in our game, he can play d5, which on the one hand closes the light-squared bishop's diagonal, turning the bishop into a bad bishop. On the other hand, by playing d5, white has crossed the center of the board, creating a pawn chain, and this pawn chain restricts black's position, so white gets a space advantage. The knight must retreat, and we have reached the first critical position. So what should white do now? The first moves that come to mind are the natural developing moves such as knight c3 or short castle. However, there is a deeper idea. In order to find Tarrasch's next move, you should first find black's chances for counterplay. How can black try to liberate himself? Actually, there are two standard ways black can do it, and with his next move, Tarrasch takes measures against both of them. You can pause the video and try to find it. So, black can liberate himself by attacking white's pawn chain, which is restricting his position. And in order to do it, he can try either f5, attacking the base of white's pawn chain, or by playing c6, attacking the d5 pawn. So, instead of making natural developing moves, Tarrasch moves the already developed piece for the second time, bishop d3. The bishop wasn't doing anything on c4 anymore after white closed its diagonal with d5, but on d3. On the one hand, the bishop, together with the e4 pawn, controls the f5 square, preventing the f5 break. On the other hand, as white has moved away the bishop from c4, now the pawn's way to c4 is open, and if black attacks the d5 pawn and captures it, so as soon as black plays c6, white will play c4, and if black captures, white can always recapture with the c pawn, retaining his pawn chain. Knight f6 followed, Tarrasch plays c4, and black's position is cramped, and when you have little space, it's always a good idea to exchange as many pieces as possible. Otherwise, your pieces will stand in each other's way and it will be difficult to maneuver. Considering this, it would have made sense for black to play bishop g4. And if white plays h3, black can exchange a pair of minor pieces, after which, of course, white gets the advantage of two bishops, but at least black has exchanged a pair of pieces, and now he has more space to maneuver his remaining pieces. But instead of bishop g4, black simply castles, which is perfectly playable. However, now Tarrasch plays h3, preventing bishop g4. As you see, all these squares, g4, f5, e6, are unavailable for the bishop. So the only square left for the black bishop is the d7 square. Black plays c6. He tries to create some counter chances on the queen side. Knight c3 followed and knight a6. The idea is to invade the great c5 square, with a tempo by attacking the bishop. White will most probably retain his bishop by moving it to c2, after which black will play a5, preventing white from playing b4, which would kick the c5 knight out of this square, and the black knight will remain on the great c5 square. But after restricting black's light squared bishop, Tarrasch restricts the knight too by playing bishop e3. It turns out that knight c5 doesn't work now, because white would simply exchange, and after d takes e, white is winning the central pawn. For this reason, as knight c5 doesn't, after bishop e3, as knight c5 doesn't work, and as the knight isn't doing much on a6, black plays knight c7. However, on c7, of course, the knight is passively placed, and only now Tarrasch castles. Black plays knight e8, unblocking the f-pawn. He wants to play f5. He is cramped, as you see, his pieces are squeezed. They are all placed on the first two ranks, so by playing f5, he wants to get some space. But Tarrasch prevents it one more time. He plays queen c2. Now the pawn, together with the bishop and the queen, all control this square, making f5 advance impossible. Black exchanges on d5, opening the c-file. Of course, white doesn't capture with the e-pawn. That would be a terrible mistake because of f5, and black gets very good counter chances on the king side. So, of course, white recaptures with the c-pawn, retaining his pawn chain, which keeps restricting black's position. And black plays g6, taking the f5 square under control one more time and renewing his idea of f5. He's going to play f5 next move. So you can pause the video and try to find how white should prevent the f5 advance in the most precise way. So the standard idea, of course, is to play g4 in order to take the f5 square under full control. However, if white plays g4 right away, it's true, he prevents the f5 advance, but black can advance his h-pawn, attacking the g4 pawn and threatening to capture it. And white, of course, cannot capture on h5, as he would lose the h3 pawn with a tempo. So after g4 h5, as his pawn is under attack, white would be almost forced to play knight h2 to defend the pawn, but his knight would be passively placed, and black can play knight f6, increasing the pressure on g4, and black gets some counter chances on the king side. For this reason, before playing g4, Tarrasch first plays bishop h6, blockading the h-pawn with a tempo, forcing black to play knight g7. And now that black cannot play h5 anymore, he plays g4, taking the f5 square under full control. Now if black plays f5, white will exchange, opening his bishops and queens diagonal. Besides that, after possible g takes f, after all these mass exchanges on the f5 square, the g-file will also open, and white can play king h2, rook g1, and putting more pressure on the pinned g7 knight and on the black king. So f5 doesn't work at the moment. That's why black brings his knight, which isn't doing anything on c7, closer to the king side, so that it takes part in the defense of the king side, and king h2, preparing rook g1, so making f5 even more problematic. In the anticipation of rook g1, black also moves his king away from the g-file and rook g1, preventing f5 once and for all. And as he cannot do anything on the king side, black plays bishop d7, vacating the c8 square for the rook in order to get some counterplay on the c-file. And what should white do now? It's true, he has cramped his opponent on the king side. Black doesn't have any counter chances on the king side. But what next? Next, white must open files on the king side. And the only way of doing that is to play f4. Threatening, actually, after f4, to play f5, which would cramp black even more. So once white plays f4, black will be forced to capture on f4, after which the f file would open for the white rooks. Besides that, the white can prepare the advance of his pawn to e5. But of course, at the moment, the knight is standing in front of the f pawn. So first white must move away his knight in order to play f4. But if he plays knight e1 right away, the knight would close the queen's rook's way to the king side. For this reason, before playing knight e1, Tarrasch plays rook g2 in order to move the queen's rook to g1, and only then knight e1 and then f4. Rook c8 followed, rook g1 of course, and it's very difficult to find moves for black. He's completely squeezed. Probably it would be the best thing black can do in this position would be knight f6 followed by knight g8 in order to kick the bishop out of h6 square. But instead black plays b6, which was a dubious decision, because by playing b6, black permanently weakens the c6 and the a6 squares. However, at the moment it isn't obvious how white can exploit these weaknesses, because white is going to play on the king side. But later in the game, these weaknesses will prove to be crucial, decisive. So, we have reached another critical position. White has already moved his queen's rook to g1, and it might seem that now everything is ready for knight e1 and f4. However, the immediate knight e1 would be premature. So you can pause the video, try to find why knight e1 is premature, and what is a better move which prepares knight e1. So, the knight, together with the bishop, controls the g5 square, and for this reason black cannot play bishop g5. If white plays knight e1 right away, black would exchange his bad bishop, as the bishop is restricted by its own pawns on the dark squares. Black would exchange his bad bishop for white's good bishop. And besides that, any exchange would be in black's favor. And after bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, black solves all his problems and almost equalizes. For this reason, before playing knight e1, Tarrasch plays queen d2, taking the g5 square under control and preventing bishop g5. And he will play knight e1 next move. Black plays knight f6, preparing knight g8 to kick the bishop out of h6, and only now knight e1. So, black plays knight g8, attacking the bishop retreats, and white is ready to play f4, which will be very unpleasant for black. For this reason, black prevents it by playing g5, taking the f4 square under full control and preventing f4 advance once and for all. However, the g5 move has a serious drawback. Actually, it has two serious drawbacks. The first one is that it permanently weakens the f5 square, but at the moment, of course, it isn't clear how white can exploit this, because the f5 square is defended by the bishop and the knight, but as you will see, one of white knights will occupy this square when the right time comes. And the second drawback of the g5 move is that the pawn, the g5 pawn, turns into a target of the h-pawn. White is going to play h4, and that will lead to the opening of the h-file, and the black king is on this file, so that will be very unpleasant for black. So, the f-pawn cannot move anymore. That means the knight isn't doing anything on e1, so the knight returns to f3 with a tempo, attacking the g5 pawn. That's why f6 followed, defending it, and now h4, threatening to win a pawn by capturing on g5. If black captures himself, then that would be in white's favor, because the h-file opens. Besides that, the white knight from h4 can invade the f5 square when the right time comes. For this reason, instead of capturing on h4, black defends his g5 pawn by playing h6. Rook h1 follows, creating an unpleasant X-ray on the H-file. And white is ready to move his king away from the H-file, after which he will threaten to capture on G5, and black won't be able to recapture with the H-pawn as it will be pinned. So black decides to escape with the king from the king side. So he plays king H7 with the idea of king G6, king F7 and king E8, moving the king away from the dangerous area. King G1 of course follows. Now white is threatening to win a pawn one more time as the H-pawn is pinned. That's why king G6 unpinning the H-pawn. And what next? The F5 square is weakened. So Tarrasch executes a knight maneuver. The F3 knight isn't doing much on F3 on this square, so Tarrasch plays knight H2 with the idea to reroute the knight to F5 via F1, and when the right time comes, the knight from F1 will need just 2 moves to jump on F5 via G3. Rook C7, vacating the C8 square for the queen, knight F1, and queen C8, attacking the G4 pawn. Black has created his first threat during the whole game. And white must defend the pawn. And how should he do that? Of course, he can play F3. But in this case, this square, the F3 square, would be unavailable for the white pieces. Tarrasch makes a more sophisticated move. Instead of F3, he defends the G4 pawn with the queen, queen E2. And the F3 square is still free, and the white queen will move to F3 later in the game and create threats to black's king side. Besides that, queen E2 has another idea, which I will offer you to find now. So black continues his escape, king F7 followed, and we have reached another critical position. So black's main weaknesses are C6 and F5. However, it isn't possible at the moment to exploit these weaknesses. So you can pause the video and try to find what should white do in order to be able to exploit weaknesses of these two squares. In order to do it, white must remove the main defender of these squares, namely the light squared bishop. And it might seem that the right move is knight b5, which would attack the rook, and it seems that black is forced to exchange his bishop. But first, black can avoid the exchange by simply moving his rook to b7. And second, black can actually exchange, and after bishop takes b5, it's true, the squares have become exposed, but black might get some counter chances. His rook might invade the second rank with a tempo, attacking the b2 pawn. For this reason, instead of immediate knight b5, and now we can see the second idea behind queen e2 move. By playing queen e2, Tarrasch created the queen and bishop battery, and his bishop can invade a6, kicking the black queen out of c8. The queen must move away, and now the queen isn't supporting the rook. The rook won't be able to invade the second rank anymore. Besides that, the b7 square is unavailable now for the rook. So only now knight b5. The rook can't move to b7, neither can it move to c2. There are no other squares for the rook, and in order to retain the material, black must exchange his valuable bishop, the most valuable piece he has. So he captures on b5, and after bishop takes b5, the c6 square has become catastrophically weakened, and the white bishop will invade this square, closing the c file and depriving black of any counter chances on this file. Besides that, the bishop controls the e8 square, preventing black's escape. And the f5 square has become weaker, as one of its defenders, the bishop, has been removed. Now there is only one remaining defender, the g7 knight. Rook c8 followed. Tarrasch captures on g5. Black must recapture. Computer recommends to recapture with the f pawn, but from human perspective it looks terrible because the h file opens and black has a target, a permanent, white rook has a permanent target, the h6 pawn. The black knight would be tied to its defense, so black captures in a more natural looking way with the h pawn. The h file opens, but at least he doesn't have weakness on h6 now, but the h file still opens. And Tarrasch closes the c file, making black's major pieces completely useless. The bishop is very strong, it's white's best piece, so black plays bishop f8, vacating the e7 square for the knight. He wants to exchange his knight for this great bishop. But Tarrasch doesn't let him do it. He plays queen f3. Now you see why it was important to leave the f3 square vacated. So by playing queen f3, Tarrasch has created an immediate threat. He has pinned the f pawn. That means white is threatening to capture on g5. How should black parry this threat? If he plays king g6, then white can simply increase his pressure on the h file, threatening to invade h8 with a tempo by attacking the knight. Then the second rook will invade the 7th rank, the h7 square, and that would be the end. And black still cannot play knight e7 to exchange this great bishop, because on g8 the knight was defending the h6 square, and now the white rook can invade, and that would lead to checkmate in 2 moves. For this reason, after queen f3, in order to parry the threat of bishop takes g5, black, as there is no other way of doing that, takes desperate measures. As his rooks are completely useless, he sacrifices the exchange in order to remove white's best piece and deflect the d5 pawn, which controls the e6 square, preventing the black knight from jumping there. After d takes e, white is still threatening to capture on g5, but now black plays knight e6, defending this pawn. However, now, so a few moves ago, white removed one of the defenders of the f5 square, the light squared bishop, and now the second defender, the knight, has left the g7 square, and that means the f5 square is exposed. And that means it's time now to continue the knight maneuver, which white started a few moves ago. Now the knight is ready to invade this great f5 square. But first Tarrasch gives a check. The king, of course, cannot move to g6 because of checkmate in 1. If he moves to e8, then still white plays queen f5, threatening to capture the knight, and there is no defense, so the knight must move. It cannot move to any other squares because of checkmate on d7, so the only square it has is c5 to defend this square, but still white would remove it, threatening checkmate in 1. For this reason, after rook h7 check, the only move is bishop g7, and now knight g3. So the knight is ready to invade this great square. Black captures the pawn and knight f5. Queen c8 followed, and Tarrasch increases the pressure, creating an immediate threat of rook takes g7, knight takes g7, and the second rook would invade the h7 square, pinning and attacking the g7 knight for the second time, and there will be no defense. For this reason, black plays knight e7, hoping to exchange this great knight. But now Tarrasch exchanges on g7. Black must capture with the knight, and the knight was defending the g5 pawn, but black must capture the knight. Now g5 isn't defended, the f pawn is still pinned, so white simply captures, threatening to capture the f6 pawn too. Showalter defends the f6 pawn, and without waiting for the obvious bishop h6, which would attack the pinned knight for the second time, and there will be no defense. Without waiting for this, Showalter in this position resigned. And now I recommend watching another strategic masterpiece where Tarrasch uses the power of 2 bishops to completely squeeze his opponent. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.